Welcome back, ghosts, ghouls, and things that go bump in the night. As you all know by now, I have quite a love for classic horror literature, and today's story is no exception. If you like a good ghost story, like you know I do, you'll want to tune in for The Water Ghost of Harrowby Hall by John Kendrick Bangs. The trouble with Harrowby Hall was that it was haunted, and what was worse, the ghost did not content itself with merely appearing at the bedside of the afflicted person who saw it, but persisted in remaining there for one mortal hour before it would disappear. It never appeared except on Christmas Eve, and then as the clock was striking 12, in which respect alone it was lacking in that originality which, in those days, was a sign of success in spectral life. The owners of Harrowby Hall had done their utmost to rid themselves of the damp and dewy lady who rose up out of the best bedroom floor at midnight, but without avail. They had tried stopping the clock so that the ghost would not know when it was midnight, but she made her appearance just the same. And, with that fearful personality of hers, there she would stand until everything about her was thoroughly saturated. Then, the owners of Harrowby Hall caulked up every crack in the floor with the very best quality of hemp, and over this were placed layers of tar and canvas. The walls were made waterproof, and the doors and windows likewise, the proprietors having conceived the notion that the unexercised lady would find it difficult to leak into the room after these precautions had been taken. But even this did not suffice. The following Christmas Eve, she appeared as promptly as before, and frightened the occupant of the room quite out of his senses by sitting down alongside of him and gazing with her carnivorous blue eyes into his. And he noticed, too, that her long, aquously bony fingers, dripping bits of seaweed, were entwined, the ends hanging down, and those ends she drew across his forehead until he became like one insane. And then he swooned away and was found unconscious in his bed the next morning by his host, simply saturated with seawater and fright, from the combined effects of which he never recovered, dying 4 years later of pneumonia and nervous prostration at the age of 78. The next year, the master of Harrowby Hall decided not to have the best spare bedroom opened at all, thinking that perhaps the ghost's thirst for making herself disagreeable would be satisfied by haunting the furniture. But the plan was as unavailing as the many that had preceded it. The ghost appeared as usual in the room. That is, it was supposed she did, for the hangings were dripping wet the next morning. In the parlor below the haunted room, a great damp spot had appeared on the ceiling. Finding no one there, she immediately set out to learn the reason why, and she chose none other to haunt than the owner of Harrowby himself. She found him in his own cozy room, drinking whiskey undiluted, and congratulating himself on having foiled her ghost ship, when all of a sudden the curl went out of his hair, his whiskey bottle filled and overflowed, and he was himself in a condition similar to that of a man who has fallen into a water pit. When he recovered from the shock, which was a painful one, he saw before him the lady of the carnivorous eyes and seaweed fingers. The sight was so unexpected and so terrifying that he fainted, but immediately came to, because of the vast amount of water in his hair, which, trickling down over his face, restored his consciousness. Now, it so happened that the master of Harrowby was a brave man, and while he was not particularly fond of interviewing ghosts, especially such quenching ghosts as the one before him, he was not to be daunted by an apparition. He had paid the lady the compliment of fainting from the effects of his first surprise, and now that he had come to, he intended to find out a few things he felt he had the right to know. He would have liked to put on a dry suit of clothes first, but the apparition declined to leave him for an instant until her hour was up, and he was forced to deny himself that pleasure. Every time he would move, she would follow him, with the result that everything she came in contact with got a dunking. And, in an effort to warm himself, he approached the fire. An unfortunate move, as it turned out, because it brought the ghost directly over the fire, which immediately was extinguished. The whiskey became utterly valueless as a comforter to his chilled system, because it was, by this time, diluted to a proportion of 90% of water. The only thing he could do to ward off the evil effects of this encounter, he did, and that was to swallow 2 10-grain quarine pills, which he managed to put into his mouth before the ghost had time to interfere. Having done this, he turned with some asperity to the ghost and said, "Far be it from me to be impolite to a woman, madam, but I'm hanged if it wouldn't please me better if you'd stop these infernal visits of yours to this house. Go out to the lake if you'd like that sort of thing. Soak in the water pit if you'd wish, but do not, I implore you, come into a gentleman's house and saturate him and his possessions in this way. It is damned disagreeable."
Henry Hartwick Oglethorpe,
said the ghost in a gurgling voice.
"You don't know what you were talking about."
"Madam," returned the unhappy householder, "I wish that remark were strictly truthful. I was talking about you. It would be shillings and pence, nay, pounds, in my pocket, madam, if I did not know you."
"That is a bit of sensuous nonsense,"
returned the ghost, throwing a quart of indignation into the face of the master of Harrowby.
"It may rank high as repartee, but as a comment upon my statement that you do not know what you are talking about, it savors of irrelevant impertinence. You do not know that I am compelled to haunt this place year after year by an inexplorable fate. It is no pleasure to me to enter this house, to ruin and mildew everything I touch. I never aspired to be a shower bath, but it is my doom. Do you know who I am?"
"No, I don't," returned the master of Harrowby. "I should say you were the Lady of the Lake, or Little Sally Waters."
"You are a witty man for your years,"
said the ghost. "Well, my humor is drier than yours will ever be," returned the master.
"No doubt. I'm never dry. I am the water ghost of Harrowby Hall, and dryness is a quality entirely beyond my wildest hope. I have been the incumbent of this highly unpleasant office for 200 years tonight."
"How the deuce did you ever come to get elected?" said the master.
"Through a suicide. I am the ghost of that fair maiden whose picture hangs over the mantelpiece in the drawing room. I should have been your great, 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 great aunt if I had lived, Henry Hartwick Oglethorpe, for I was the own sister of your great, 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 great father.
But what induced you to get this house into such a predicament?
I was not to blame, sir.
Returned the lady.
It was my father's fault. He it was who built Harrowby Hall, and the haunted chamber was to have been mine. My father had it furnished in pink and yellow, knowing well that blue and gray formed the only combination of color I could tolerate. He did it merely to spite me, and, with what I deem a proper spirit, I declined to live in the room. Thereupon my father said I could live there or on the lawn. He didn't care which. That night, I ran from the house and jumped over the cliff into the sea.
That was rash, said the master of Harrowby.
So I've heard. If I had known what the consequences were to be, I should not have jumped. But I really never realized what I was doing until after I was drowned. I had been drowned a week when a sea nymph came to me and informed me that I was to be one of her followers forever afterwards, adding that it should be my doom to haunt Harrowby Hall for 1 hour every Christmas Eve throughout the rest of eternity. I was to haunt that room on such Christmas Eves as I found it inhabited, and if it should turn out not to be inhabited, I was and am to spend the allotted hour with the head of the house.
I'll sell the place.
That you cannot do, for it is also required of me that I shall appear as the deeds are to be delivered to any purchaser, and divulge to him the awful secret of this house.
Do you mean to tell me that on every Christmas Eve that I don't happen to have somebody in that guest chamber, you are going to haunt me wherever I may be, ruining my whiskey, taking all the curl out of my hair, extinguishing my fire, and soaking me through the skin? Demanded the master.
You have stated the case, Oglethorpe, and what is more, it doesn't make the slightest difference where you are. If I find that room empty, wherever you may be, I shall douse you with my spectral presence.
Here the clock struck 1, and immediately the apparition faded away. It was perhaps more of a trickle than a fade, but as a disappearance, it was complete. By St. George and the Dragon, exclaimed the master of Harrowby, wringing his hands. It is guineas to hot cross buns that next Christmas there is an occupant of the spare room, or I shall spend the night in the bathtub. But the master of Harrowby would have lost his wager had there been anyone there to take him up, for when Christmas Eve came again, he was in his grave, having never recovered from the cold contracted that awful night. Harrowby Hall was closed, and the heir to the estate was in London, where to him and his chambers came the same experience that his father had gone through, saving only that being younger and stronger, he survived the shock. Everything in his rooms was ruined. His cloaks were rusted in the works. A fine collection of watercolor drawings was entirely obliterated by the onslaught of the water ghost. And what was worse, the apartments below his were drenched in the water soaking through the floors, a damage for which he was compelled to pay, and which resulted in his being requested by the landlady to vacate the premises immediately. I'm afraid, dear listeners, That's where we have to break off this story for now. But don't fret, it won't be long at all before I will be back with the second part of The Water Ghost of Harrowby Hall. Until then, do you have a favorite classic horror story? Let me know what it is. Maybe I'll feature it on the show. You can find me on Facebook at Haunted Horrorstorian, or send me an email at hauntedhorrorstorian@gmail.com. Until next time, my wonderful listeners, stay spooky, and remember, sometimes it's more than just a story.